In 1987, President Ronald Reagan proclaimed March National Developmental Disabilities Awareness Month. And typically during this month, we've spoken about families and consumers and how important they are to the world and to the field. And we seem to forget the advocates that really take time out of their lives to make this field work. So today, EDCSPIN decided to interview Pete Pierri, the Executive Director of the InterAgency Council of Developmental Disability Agencies. Tell me a little bit about yourself. Who is Pete Pierri?
Well, I have been working in this field since 1976. I prefer for you to do that math instead of me. And I actually got into the field of developmental disabilities after I received my master's in social work from Delphi University. And I was looking for a job and happened to apply for the job at a local agency when I was living up in the Hudson Valley. Really not knowing much about developmental disabilities. My only experience was in high school. My best friend on Long Island, I had known for many years, and I was at his family's home one day when they mentioned that he has a sister with Down syndrome that I had never met, never seen. And it was shocking to me that someone would purposely keep a family member away from others in the community, and they talked a little bit about that, and that sort of stuck in my mind as being something that was very difficult for a family to go through. So anyway, when I was applying for the job after getting my social work degree, I was offered a position at the ARC up in Ulster County, and I accepted it, really not knowing what it would be or feeling that this was really not something I was very interested in. It's not necessarily what I went to social work school for. And it was one of those true moments in life that you really learn about yourself, and I was shocked. Maybe it took me 3 days to understand how engaged I was with this field.
It's a very similar story about needing a job. Mm-hmm. And it's the same way I got into this field. We have other colleagues who got in the field the same way. What is it about this field that keeps people like us as advocates for the disabled?
For me, I think, and you and I were talking earlier about this, to me it's the fascination of knowing that the work you're doing, you can actually see the benefit for your own eyes with the people who are served by the various organizations that we work with. Giving people a helping hand to help themselves, giving them the ability to learn certain life skills that many of us don't even remember how we learned them, right? We just sort of intuitively learned them, or our parents taught us. And watching people be able to acquire those skills and feel not only better about themselves, but actually have full lives and full personalities is a very rewarding experience to have. And it's a very unique opportunity in a career choice.
It hasn't always been easy, I'm sure, to get to this point. What were some of the things that you as a young professional in the field had to get over that you now look at and say, I'm sure other people are getting over those things as well?
Well, I originally believed that interacting with people with developmental disabilities, intellectual disabilities, was going to be very boring. I thought that there would be nothing that I would get back. There was some, I guess, my own misunderstandings from never having been educated in this field before. Shockingly, when I went to college, my last year in college, I had a degree in psychology, and part of my college program was to have an internship in a local psychiatric facility. And in my senior year in college, I worked in a ward in a psychiatric hospital with young adolescents who had autism. And it was a ward with about 25, 30 boys, with 3 staff, with the TV up in the corner. I was taught by the psychiatric staff that these children were there because their parents were emotionally distant from them. That old theory, which obviously has been proven very untrue. This is not ancient history. This is in the early 1970s. So there are still a lot of misunderstandings that people have that you have to get over. The other thing, very honestly, that didn't exist back then was training. Right. No one taught me how to help someone with certain behavior issues or certain life skills. And I'm so grateful that now we are much more focused on ensuring that the staff who work to support people have sufficient training to know how to offer those supports.
Tell me a little bit about some of those skills you think a professional in the field needs to have in order to be successful.
I think one of the big things is and this may sound strange because it's something different than we normally talk to. Listening skills and observation skills, and we don't really talk much about that in our field. But in order to truly treat each person as an individual, how you learn about them is how I learn about you, you learn about me, how we learn about each other right now. You're listening, you're asking, you're observing. And that's a very important skill for a staff person to have, regardless of what your role is. Because without that, all the training, the technical training in the world, is not going to help you really understand how to assist this particular person that you're supporting.
So obviously we both have come up in the field. We grew up in the field, we've worked through different positions. What would you tell a young direct support professional who is looking to grow in the field and make this a career, not just a job? What do they need to do to get from point A to point B?
Well, I think a lot depends upon, and I'm not trying to skirt the answer, but I think a lot depends upon what their real career objectives are. Unfortunately, in our industry to date, for direct support professionals, their career path really needs to be something other than direct support work if they're going to achieve salary levels that they might be achieving. Right. And I think that that's a shame. I wish that we truly had a structure where you could still stay doing some type of direct support work and still, be able to advance it significantly. But if you have a goal of moving along in your organization to a variety of positions, you have to, really be interested in learning how organizations work, how various people's roles interplay with each other, and have an understanding of the systems that work within an organization to understand where do you want to go in that is most fulfilling to you as a person.
At IAC, I know that you have talked about this in the past. We don't seem to have a young professional pool of people ready to step into leadership. So when we talk about the goal of a direct support professional just being that for a career, how do we get people interested in the executive level roles, knowing all the responsibility that you currently have or that I currently have?
So if I could relate this to my own professional path, when I was a lot younger, after having graduated from social work school, right, my first job was as a social worker because my professional goal was to be a social worker. Right. And back then, in the 70s, when there was still a lot of the revolution going on, right? I thought that administration was the last thing I wanted to do. That administration was the dirty word, right? I'm going to be a clinician. I'm going to be with the people, and because that work is bad work, that's for bureaucrats, etc. And I had to get over that, and I'm glad I did because I found out by being exposed to certain roles, administrative roles, that I actually liked it. Surprised myself because originally I was closed off to that. So I think, using that as an example, I think that what we don't do, I think, very well right now is really have some kind of either mentorship or apprenticeship kinds of opportunities for direct support staff in other kind of roles in organizations that might expose them to some managerial and administrative responsibilities to sort of test out their level of interest and test out their capabilities in it. And that's something we probably should be investing more in.
When you look at the role you have now, what is your role at IAC? What do you do as the executive director of IAC?
Well, I'm glad you're asking me and not my staff.
Okay.
I might get two different answers. My role, like many executive directors, is multifaceted, of course, and there's at least two different parts to it. One is the external role, and one is the internal role. I have an organization that I'm responsible for managing. Now, our organization, because of the kind of provider association we have about 26 employees.
Feel free to let us know what IAC does, etc.
IAC we are an association of nonprofit providers, nonprofit providers who all serve children and or adults with developmental disabilities. We have about 150 agencies that are part of our association in the downstate New York area. And our job is to help represent them on legislative issues, on advocacy issues. We also provide technical assistance to them. We become the bridge and communicator between some government entities and agencies and helping to explain regulations. We also do a lot of, on behalf of our providers' interests, we also provide input to state government and make recommendations on changes in policy, changes in regulations, rate structures, etc. So that's what we do. We also have a very large function here where we have an entire collaborative effort where we coordinate transportation here in the city for about 5,700 people every day through a variety of agencies, but that's a whole other discussion,
yes,
which we'll talk about some other time tomorrow. So that's what our organization does. So we have about 26 people here. We also do a lot of staff training for our member agencies. So part of my role, as the role of any executive director, is to manage the operations that my staff are involved with, and that's day-to-day management stuff. But besides that, I have an external role. I am the face of the organization. I'm the spokesperson for the organization. I do a lot of interactive conversations with our provider agencies. I'm in Albany, sometimes on average once a week, sometimes it's twice a week, sometimes it's twice a month, at various meetings with state government officials, trying to work out issues on behalf of our provider agencies.
So when you think about the government and the interaction, how is the interaction with government in your role? Is it confrontational? Is it harmonious? Is it collaborative? What would you describe the role as, and what would you like to change about the role in order to make it better?
I would not describe the role as confrontational, and of course everybody has their own different style too. Mm-hmm. I believe that to be an effective voice for our provider agencies, one of the first things I have to have is credibility, because it doesn't matter whether someone in the government is going to agree with me or not if they don't listen to me to begin with.
Right.
So, I believe that however I carry out my role in various ways, that I have to do it in a way that I promote the credibility of our position in order to enhance the likelihood that some of the government is even going to give listen to the position I'm trying to make. So in that light, you have to be honest with people. Mm-hmm. You have to be able to see both sides of a discussion. Unfortunately, it's sometimes very uncomfortable for me that sometimes I have to disagree with some of our providers on certain things. Obviously I have to disagree with government on, many times on certain things. I can't just be a blanket agree with any side, because then I lose all credibility. Right. So I have to be able to demonstrate that I've thought through an issue in a factual way in order for our position to be viable.
Well, you've actually done a very good job at that, and I think we've talked about that before. When you think about your role, is being a provider at some point in your career help you become a better executive director in an association role? And if so, do you think that that's what's missing in Albany?
I do believe that having been a provider of an agency for so long before I worked here was very good preparation for me. I'm not saying that it is essential and necessary for someone else, but certainly for me, it has been able to give me the opportunity to be able to relate to these issues in a way where, to me, they're not just theoretical problems or issues. I can actually anchor them in specific examples of when I was running an organization. I can relate to an issue to a specific, and I hope, that helps me articulate them in a way that maybe makes them more understandable. So for me, I think it's a tremendous benefit. In terms of Albany, the one thing that is a little different in our field, excuse me, is that the State Office of Developmental Disabilities is a provider, which is different from many of the other state agencies. So they also operate some of the same programs that our providers operate. So there, in many levels, there is an understanding of the provider perspective. However, it's filtered by the fact that they're also the governing body and the funder and the political entity that's overseeing it. So it is different, but there is at least, some sense of what it means to be a provider, what it means to have audits, what it means to have employee issues, what it means to, have accusations of
Right.
poor quality,
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately on certain occasions. So they go through that themselves as a provider as well.
When you talk about the role of poor quality, there has obviously been things that have not been favorable to the field. What is your role in trying to navigate an understanding of what the provider is going through and what the state is requiring?
That has been, particularly because of the publicity around those topics in the past 2 years, that has been one of the more difficult areas that I have found in my role. Because certainly I will never, apologize for someone who has mistreated somebody. And that is certainly not my role, and professionally I can never do that. However, what I really object to is the aspersions that are therefore cast on the entire industry. And I really resent, those situations being used as a rationale for other decisions that are being made. And, the assumption that all providers are bad or providing bad services or cheating in some way, that's a poor excuse for public policy. You don't create public policy based upon that. You deal with those situations head on, as we must, and we must eradicate any of those situations where someone is either misusing funds or someone is mistreating somebody, and you deal with them head on and directly and get over it and make the system better.
Well, we've seen those stories over the last 2 years. There is nothing that we can do to hide them. Do you think that we as providers, or you as an association exec, or the other association execs, do a good job with putting good stories out? Obviously, we know what sells in papers. Is there anything that we can do to actively make sure that good stories are getting out there?
I do think that it's unfortunate that, in our society, generally, media is not focused on telling people day-to-day stories, because then it's not news. It's a story. It's not news. And it's a very difficult situation to be in, to try to get media to pay attention to some of the very important things that go on day-to-day in all the services that agencies provide. The one area that I think that we're probably not as good at that we should be, or try to be at, is it's very different when a family tells that story about how this service or support has impacted their family and their family unit. We probably have not been as creative as we should be, and as aggressive as maybe we could be in trying various avenues to get those stories out. So, and I think that's important. We need to realize, again, going back in some of our histories, the 1970s, 80s, and even 1990s, our industry was viewed as a golden industry. We were viewed as the saviors. We community providers were the ones that brought people out of state institutions that people realize now they never should have been in. Mm-hmm. We were the positive alternative. We were the ones that were fixing the problem.
Right.
Now what's happened is that in many respects, unfortunately, providers have been viewed as part of the problem. Mm-hmm. And I honestly just don't believe that's true. And we have to really work much harder and differently at how to change that public perception with facts, because there are hundreds of thousands of people being served, 100,000 people being served throughout New York State, and there are wonderful stories, and people are benefiting all the time from the supports that they're getting.
Well, with the wonderful stories that can be told, the field is changing. What do you see the changes that are occurring in New York State for the disabled population? And are they good? Are they productive? Or will we be in a position where there might be some rocky times ahead?
Well, I think that any change always brings rocky times. I think the unfortunate part is that right now we are going through an unprecedented number of changes at the same time, that I don't believe that any single person has the vision about what the cumulative impact of all these changes will be. I think that people have a vision of how each individual change might result in some impact somewhere, but I don't think anybody yet can figure out cumulatively what will happen. With that said, there is New York State has determined that the direction is to move towards a managed care approach to services to people with developmental disabilities. That decision's been made. Whether we agree with it or not, and some of us have some concerns about it, I think that no longer matters. To me, what matters now is our role in making this the best system we can under that environment.
Right.
And as a provider association, I think our responsibility is to ensure that that's the conversation. That the conversation is not about people wishing we were back, 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. The conversation must be what protections we have to build into the system, what incentives do we have to build into the system, how do we create the structures so that we maximize how limited public dollars can still yield tremendous results for people. And that's our job right now.
You obviously touched on a number of different points. With that being the case, there has been a period of time where we rallied. We took buses and cars and went to Albany to governor's office. Obviously, there is a push that doesn't work anymore. So what should advocacy be for this generation this time?
Well, I almost want to answer that in two different ways. So,
you can.
So I will
Please.
Anyway. Yeah. But again, I wanted to just sort of go back to what I was just saying, relating to, and that is that there has to be a very strong voice about the protections for people. We have to ensure that services that people need are still available to them. I think that there is a concern that people with more severe and complex disabilities are not going to be given the variety of supports that might be necessary for their particular conditions under a managed care environment, because people believe that things wind up getting averaged out, and when you average things out, you sort of lose both ends. And I think that that's something that, whether it's true or not, people are afraid of. So I think that that's something we have to actively focus on to ensure that all people, regardless of the level of your disability, have the proper support network put in place in terms of what they need to accomplish in their life. On the other hand, the other issue that is somewhat separate from this, and is particularly a downstate issue, is that there are still quite a number of people living at home with their families, their families who are aging, and there has been a slowdown in the amount of services being made available to them going forward, and that to me is a major advocacy area that is going to have to be addressed in the very near future.
Well, I'm sure that you do not do all of this at IAC on your own. At EDC, we have a simple mantra that everybody paddles at the same time in the same direction toward the same goal. The part about everyone has to do their part. Tell me about your team here at IAC.
Okay, so we have a number of our staff. I won't go into everyone's roles,
right, exactly.
But we have our transportation service, which again we'll not to diminish that, that's a different service. We'll talk about that later. But we have people who work with our provider agencies and giving them technical knowledge and information, and that some of that is one-on-one questions and answers. Some of it is training sessions we set up. We gather people here very frequently to share best practices, amongst them. But as you said, no one does any of this alone. And my concept is that everyone shares in our organization vision. The woman who says hello to people when they walk in the door, and we've talked about this here. We've actually had some training sessions here on how we are supposed to interact with our member agencies when they walk in. Because it doesn't matter what your role is here. We recently hired a person to oversee our IT functions. Right? His role is not just an internal one, but he needs to understand our organizational mission, because at some point he's going to have to interact with our provider agencies. I want him to know what they do. We're going to have to get him out to start visiting some of our provider agencies. I want him to see the actual services that they provide. It may not necessarily have to do with his job here, but in order for him to understand why our job is important, he has to understand why their job is important. So it doesn't matter what your role is. We're all part of the same pie. We just do our jobs differently to achieve our organization's mission.
What motivates you to continue in this field?
I have been very lucky Since I got in the field of developmental disabilities, I've had a total of 3 jobs, and that's over 38 years. I obviously don't change very often. I am so fortunate. I have loved every job I've had, including the one I have now. It motivates me. I am very motivated towards figuring how to figure out to do things differently. Those kind of challenges I find intriguing and challenging, but fulfilling. And also, I get our member agencies, what they do every day and the challenges they have every day, it actually gives me pleasure. It's going to sound strange. Pleasure when they call us with a problem, because if we can help them take something off their plate or help them solve something that's distracting them from the actual services they're supposed to be providing, it's great to do that.
What do you think are the national things that might affect the local things here in the state?
Well, I do spend a bit of time talking with some national organizations in our field, and New York State has almost become the poster child for change throughout the country. And the federal government is actually telling some other states who are starting to go through some of the same changes, watch what happens in New York for some of the things that the federal government is expecting in terms of changes in the field. So it's an interesting situation to be in, because New York State itself is also, because of our history here with institutions and our history here of the Willowbrook and the advocacy from that, our array of services here in New York is far different and superior and immensely more comprehensive than almost any other state in the country. So changing our systems is much more complex than some other state changing their systems.
Right.
So it's hard to use some other states' experiences. I mean, we have to learn from them, but we have to take what they have learned and figure out what does that mean in New York. You can't necessarily just transplant something that happened in Michigan and say that can work in New York, but you can figure out what pieces of that may work here, and that's sort of the process that we're.
Last question: what do you think? Well, not what do you think. What's next for Pierri and IAC? And not that they have to be both jointly together.
We are in such a flux of transition in our field that, I don't see a lot of changes for IAC in the immediate future, except using technology different to fulfill our mission and our organization goals. Our goal, my goal for the immediate future, next year or two, is to bring stability to the field. Stability, I don't mean by not lack of change, but I mean helping providers get through the changes and helping them figure out what the changes mean for them, and trying to ensure that the changes that incur are meaningful, practical, and result in the outcomes we're looking for the people that are served. And get to a point of a little homeostasis, a little respite from the series of changes, and allow people, the breathing room to ensure that the quality of what they're doing is what they expect.
And what about Pete?
I'm here for the duration. I'm not going anywhere.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Pete. I'm glad I'm able to do this.
Delightful.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Phil.